Good evening, everyone. My name is Don Gates, an alcoholic. I sat and listened to all of the people who have worked on this committee being honored. And I'd like to carry that on a little bit. Well, all of those people who didn't do a goddamn thing worthy of notice and who are not related to the chairman, would you please stand? Where would all these servants be without us? For the benefit of the people who listen to these tapes, I sometimes describe what the room is like. Here, for those of you who may listen to it, there are two blazing lights right in my eyes. As far as I know, except for the front row, this room may be deserted. And directly in front of me is a small little light blazing away that is a television camera. It is closed circuit, they told me. They assured me that, well, I mean, one goes to the Vice Squad in Costa Mesa, and the other goes to Attorney General Ashcroft. But neither of them need fear anything from me at my age, and nor do they need to fear AA. I mean, even when we were drinking, we did not endanger Western civilization. We're not that well organized. It's the non-alcoholics you have to worry about. There are times when I think of AA as a little series of islands in a sea of lunacy. But of course, we're not organized even after we get together. I did the public relations for Los Angeles 35 some years or so ago. And when you spoke at the various groups, the hardest thing to explain to them was that the lack of organization in AA. You know, I mean, how do you tell them we have no rules, no regulations, no bylaws, no credos, no loyalty oaths, and the rankest newcomer has exactly the same rights as the oldest old-timer? I mean, well, if he looks like he's going to vomit on you, you can ask him to move over one seat. Unless you're Peggy and want to snuggle up to him. And when they always ask, well, what do you do when some newcomer comes in and starts trying to take over? We just wait. We don't have to expose each other. We have a built-in governor. If you get too far out in left field, you get taken drunk. But this group, actually, I can see quite a few of it, and you clean up very nicely. There's no question about it. And I even see some gray hairs beside mine here, too, which is good. I don't speak much anymore, and so many young people are in AA now. You know, I started to talk the other day, and I could hear some young lady in front saying to her girlfriend, what is that old goat possibly going to say, you know, to have meaning for a swinger like us? You know, a fast bicycle ride and a love affair would kill him. And you know, and that's not really true. I go pretty good on a bicycle. But I did speak at your very first convention, apparently. And Jack, your chairman, said I helped him a lot. That's why he kept decided to come back to find out what the hell that was all about. I couldn't understand it. We also have I retired 7 years ago and moved up to the Central Coast, and we now have, it was a great cultural shock when you move from the megalopolis to a small area, rural area. You're used to these huge meetings, speaker meetings, half of them, and you move to a small area where there's just a handful of people virtually. And within 2 meetings, you know what everybody's going to say in their inarticulate but sincere way. And though they're very loving and sweet and gentle, they wouldn't say a harsh word against anybody. There's an undercurrent of hostility in the room against anybody from Los Angeles. And we finally found a meeting that we liked over in a little town called Templeton, because there the hostility is right out in the open. I mean, we get no respect at all. And I ran into, by gosh, a fellow who said he had no place to hide. He tried to get away from it, but he's up here, Carlos, from our little meeting in Atascadero, and he said if I would mention him, he'd tell people I did all right. But it really is a meeting. You know, laughing about the things we used to cry about seems to be one of the primary secrets of our program. And in this meeting here, they do not allow you to become serious about yourself. It is a great, lively, fun meeting. We had a woman come in one night who was talking about how she was so delighted that her daughter had brought her new husband home for Christmas holidays to meet them. But she said she found out what he did for a living, and it was just too embarrassing to even discuss. She just couldn't even mention it. Well, naturally, what happened, everybody started beating on the table, tell us, tell us, tell us. And she finally broke down and said, well, he's an exotic dancer. And so I was called on next, and I said, well, I don't see why that should be difficult. At Christmas, you'll know exactly what to give him. Just stick $20 down his G-string. And, you know, and the meeting deteriorated from there on down. By the time we left, the woman was laughing and feeling great and realizing how absolutely silly was her problems. And I think that's what AA is like, to learn to laugh about the things we used to cry about. That's what it's all for. But Jack here did, and a couple other people did want me to tell. You know, Moses had the same trouble. Everywhere he went, they said, tell us about the burning bush, Moses. And I have a story that was kind of an insight to me. I don't know that it was a direct revelation, but I will tell it since it had been requested here. I should preface it, of course, by saying that I drank almost exclusively to relax. And on this occasion that I will regale you about, I've been relaxed for about a week. And I was asleep, and I came to with a fitful, horrible dream. It was Dante's Inferno, imps of the perverse. I could almost smell the sulfur, hot and fuming, and I staggered to my feet, and indeed, I was actually dripping with perspiration. And I thought, well, what's wrong? You know, I looked around, and I saw that my family had gone wherever they go at night, and I had nodded off on the couch. And for a moment, I did fleetingly think that maybe alcohol had played some role in my problem, but then I noticed such wasn't the case. From this couch, the covering of it, there was a small hole near where my head had been, and from it there was a spiral of smoke coming up. And I could see, as I say, what happened. I'd nodded off with a cigarette in my hand or my mouth, and it had fallen on top of this covering and burnt its way through into the matting, into the tacking on the inside, where, lacking oxygen to take flame, the embers had just slowly spread over the course of the evening. And so I realized it wasn't a drinking problem. I'd just been barbecued. So, commending myself on my perspicacity, I went into the kitchen, got a pitcher of water, and came back and tried to pour it into that tiny hole. produced a rather spectacular cascade on the carpet, but beyond that, nothing. So I knew more dramatic measures were demanded. I went into the kitchen again, returned this time with a butcher knife, and I slashed the couch open from one end to the other, exposing the coals, and then was able to subdue them with the cooling balm of the water. The only thing is it produced acrid black smoke. You know, it's been 60 years ago. More than half a century. Half of this a quarter of this nation's history. And yet I can still remember standing there, looking down at that slashed and sodden mess, and knowing almost to a certainty my wife was going to notice it. She was a very keen-eyed woman. There was little that passed her ken around the house, I want you to know. And although, obviously, Al-Anon had not played any role, but nonetheless, she was a good woman, and she would never do anything to assail the masculinity of the breadwinner. And yet there were times, in moments of stress, when she would say things to me that were unkind. Cruel, even. I mean, she might say, "You drunken son of a bitch, you did it again, didn't you?" You see. And then when she had calmed down, she would be absolutely devastated that she had spoken in such a way to the head of the house. Feeling great remorse, and I wanted to spare her this. The only thing I didn't know quite what to do. But for every problem, no matter how complex, there is one simple answer, which is wrong. And it occurred to me, well, the thing to do is simple enough. Get it out of the house. I mean, she might vaguely remember there'd been something on that side of the room, but out of sight, out of mind. The only thing is, it isn't easy to be moving a bed couch when you should be checking into a sanitarium. But with that Herculean strength that comes only to the panic-stricken youthful alcoholic, I somehow managed to heft that monster onto my shoulder and lurched out the front door. At that time, we were living on the second floor of an apartment building that had columns on the porch, and I virtually beat myself to death caroming off the posts trying to make the turn. But eventually I did descend, and then I discovered that, like Robert Burns's mouse, foresight was not my long suit. There is virtually no place that you can conceal a couch in a typical apartment patio. So I'm standing there. I should be in a hospital, but I'm moving furniture. And I remembered a creek about 5 miles away. And so I lurched to my car, and I hefted that brute up on top and got in to drive to my selected place of repose. Now, all I have ever really wanted and inspired to in life was dignity. I have not cavilled at disaster when I could face it with dignity. But now, as I was going down the street, by this time it was, I don't know what time it was, but it was daylight. There were people standing on the corners, with lunch pails and briefcases waiting for buses, I guess. I don't know how they can stay up that late, but you're out there. And as I proceeded down the street, I became aware that all eyes were following me. Eyes wide. Jaws agape. I thought, by golly, it doesn't take much to draw a crowd in California. I'll say that. I don't know. until I passed in front of an auto dealership that had a very dusty window, which acted like a mirror. And I got a view of what it was these people were looking at. Here's a guy driving down the street, nattily attired in a bathrobe, and a week's growth of whiskers, and on top of his car rests a couch, which previously had lacked oxygen enough to take flame. But going down the street, the wind was going through it like a billows, and the flames were 30, 40 feet in the air. Now, up until that point, I had always been able to blame any confrontations I had with society on some other member of society, because it always takes two to come into conflict. If he hadn't made a left turn, I wouldn't have hit him, which is true, but if it hadn't been an unguided missile coming down the street, I might have noticed he was making the turn a little earlier. But on this occasion, I couldn't think of a single reason or motive to blame my sleeping wife and children for having endangered their lives, as they obviously had. But that's enough of that. Just, let's say, subsequently I was to move beyond social drinking. And yet that doesn't tell you as much about me in a way as something else. Under the guise of telling what they used to be like, people get up and they describe things in their pitches. They tell about things that happened to them, almost implying they did it on purpose. I didn't do those things on purpose. They're the last things I wanted to do. I was like all newcomers, a kind, loving, gentle, easygoing kind of a person. Like one of our ex-presidents used to say, "Come, let us reason together. Let us do it my way." And they wouldn't do it. And so to describe something that happened to you, some idiotic thing like that, doesn't really tell what you were like. That's just something that happened. But our leader here was telling me that at your first convention 18 years ago, I guess, for some reason I waxed into a bit of poetry. I tend to do that when I can't think of anything else to do. And apparently what I'd recited was, when I was in college, I took a course in oral interpretation of literature or something like that. And they asked us to make a recording of some important thing that we thought it would make a good, significant piece. And then we could compare at the end of the term our recording with a later one and see if we'd improved any. And so I realized that this was a monumental moment in American history. I assumed that whatever I did would be like Laurence Olivier's soliloquy of Hamlet. It would be enshrined in a time capsule somewhere. And so I studied and reflected on all of the things I could think of in the English language worthy of my permanently immortalizing them. And I came up, of all things, I think of it now even, with the epilogue to the Shropshire Lad. Now, if you haven't read it or forgotten it, it's a series of gloomy verse about young athletes dying young and so on. And his friends, it's supposed to be written by somebody named Terence, and his friends tell him, this is gloomy stuff. Pipe a tune to dance to, lad. And Terence replies, "Well, if 'tis dancing you would be, there's brisker pipes than poetry, and malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. Ale, man, ale's the stuff to drink for fellows whom it hurts to think. Look into the pewter pot to see the world as the world is not. And oh, 'tis wondrous till 'tis past. The mischief is it will not last. Many's the time I've been to Ludlow Fair and carried halfway home or near pints and quarts of Ludlow beer. Oh, then the world was none so bad, and I myself a sterling lad. And down in lovely muck I've lain, happy till I woke again. And then I saw the morning sky, hi-ho, the tale was all a lie. The world, it was the old world yet. I was I, my things were wet, and nothing now remained to do but begin the game anew. Therefore, while in this world there's still much good, but much less good than ill, and while the sun and moon endure, luck's a chance, but trouble sure. I'd face it as a wise man would, and train for ill and not for good. Can you imagine picking out that as something to say and remembering it? 60 years later. I think that tells more about what I used to be like than some of the dumb things that happened to me. I won't get into, I know it's kind of traditional, sometimes people talk about their childhood as if that, I heard a guy speak the other day who he told about his childhood, and then kind of wiping a tear from the corner of his eye, he said, "I didn't enjoy a happy childhood." And when I spoke, I said, you told my story. I had a happy childhood, and I didn't enjoy it either. To say you're a troubled adolescence is redundancy. Adolescence is a form of insanity. And most of us begin drinking at that time. And alcohol is a great preservative. I don't mean to make fun of our present generation of young people. It's true of all of them. You look at them, don't look at me, don't look at me, look at me. They go around showing off, dressing funny, and then if you look at them, they cringe. Oh, God. The idea that we are somehow different than the other people in this world is a myth that I personally don't care too much for. It's true. Our book says that we have psychotics who are alcoholic. After all, alcoholism is a physical problem. Why shouldn't they be? Why should they get off any easier than the rest of us? And if a psychotic can really stay sober, hell, chances are he'll start a huge group and have many babies and become a guru. We have neurotics in every hue on the emotional spectrum, it says. And then we have people who are normal in every respect except the effect alcohol has on them. I've never met any of them. But I assume they were hanging around Akron when Bill got sober. But personally, I think that's very good. Because, as I said, we are not the kind of people who cause the world trouble, as it were. We have to change. We have to give up the dubious luxuries of resentment and self-pity and getting even and paying back. The book says that, for us, the brainstorm and the grouch are things that we can't afford. They're poison to us. It's like right now, and our country's in a troubled time, and people are for and against. And in AA, we have our opinions about for and against everything, too. But we're trying a different kind of a program, in a sense. I'm reminded of that story about the old Indian chief who was telling his son, inside of every human being, inside of me, you, there are two wolves fighting for supremacy. One is the wolf of hostility and hatred, and the other is the wolf of love and peace. And the kid says, which wolf is going to win? And the father says, it'll be the one we feed. And here in AA, we try desperately to feel the one of love and peace. And we don't get involved in outside affairs. We watched the Washingtonians come tumbling down a century or more ago because they got involved in other things. And by the way, when I say we change, there's no question we have to give up the dubious luxuries, as I call them, and the book calls them, of self-pity and resentment. And the alcoholic doesn't. He can cling to those things, living lives of quiet desperation. He never has to change. Nothing ever happens to him. No one has ever been arrested for driving while pissed off. You don't get picked up for being a mope and disorderly, a common mope and disorderly. We come into conflict and we have to change. We have to actually learn how to live happy lives, much as it frightens us, much as we would reject us. Most of us wouldn't cross the street if we thought it'd make us feel better. I'll stay right here and hurt. I can take it as long as you can, you bitch. But we have to change. And in a sense, we do, in that our aspirations change, but not our basic characters. I've been around AA now. I gave my first AA talk 55 years ago or so. And I have seen a lot of people come in, and we don't, in my opinion, change all that much. Our character defects, as it were, are still with us, except they are no longer defects. They tend to be used for the good of society. Many times they're converted into assets. Think of our founding father, Bill. He was a boomer, a stockbroker, a put-together of deals. Everybody else who got sober in the Oxford group, through Frank Buckman's ideas, they were happy about it. They're glad to be sober and want to carry a message, but not Bill. You're going to write a book. Write a book, make $1 million, make a big deal. If it weren't for Bill's character defect, we wouldn't have AA. No one else was doing that. He did, my gosh, because that was the way he was. And he wrote an incredible book. And fortunately, he wrote it in his manic phase. Subsequently, he went into an 8-year depression, too, which was suicidal. How did I grab you, newcomer? Promises had been fulfilled, and he was on the road of happy destiny and couldn't get out of bed. But his character trait brought about probably the most remarkable organization in this century, last century. And the most inspiring friend I ever had, Chuck Chamberlain. Here was a guy who had an incredible effect upon the lives of so many people. Most spiritual man I ever met. I would go, and he was so good for me because if he wanted to chop logic, I'd have cut him to shreds. But I'd go to him with some problem and he'd say, listen to it, and then he'd say, Don, either God is or he isn't. Oh, thank you, Chuck, thank you. It might take me 5 years to say, what the hell was that? God is or he isn't. I have degrees after my name. And yet Chuck had not changed all that much. I knew the old-timers in Beverly Hills who knew Chuck when he was drinking. And they would say, I'd walk into a bar and I'd say, buy the house a drink. And then I'd see Chuck down at the end. I'd say, not that damn preacher. I don't want to get him started. Chuck was always spiritual. He turned it into something that was incredible, helped people all over the world. Now Clancy, I knew Clancy when he hit L.A. with no teeth. Here was a flim-flam man. I quickly took his inventory and realized that it was too late. It was too far gone. That's all there was to it. But then I went out for a little sabbatical. And when I came back, he had become the secretary of a little group called the Pacific Group. And people were touching the hem of his garment. And I thought, boy, I better never drink again. I can't tell what kind of heresy is going to pop up. Now, he is still a con man, a flim-flam man, a seller of ideas, but he has helped more people than anybody I know because he can communicate in a way that touches you. Unbelievable. You can take all negative things you want about the Pacific Group or about Clancy, but his ability to work with people that nobody else can reach is astonishing. If I got a newcomer that I couldn't even, I couldn't answer his problems, hell, I couldn't even understand what he was talking about, I used to take him out to Santa Monica late at night and put him on Clancy's porch, ring the doorbell, and run. And so he hasn't really changed all that much. You see, if we think speakers often talk about, I'm just totally different now, made a complete change. I've heard them say, I came into AA, right away, boy, I made a 360-degree change. And I think, well, your geometry isn't too good, but you're closer to the truth than you think. If we can rip ourselves 1 degree off course, one little bitty degree, and it'll feel like we're being torn to shreds and nothing is left of us. But if you can tear it off 1 degree and stay there, in a number of years, you're going to be so far removed from where you would have been as to be unrecognizable by you or anybody else. But your basic character traits don't change all that much. I was a loner, always. Ideas were always and have been, regrettably, still more important to me than people. I did not become emotionally involved in life. I analyzed things. I had a certain glibness for writing. And, well, I should switch over perhaps and mention how it seems to me I may have contributed some good with those particular talents later. When I first came into AA, as many of you who've heard my past monologues know, I couldn't get a job. I was in terrible shape. And I contacted a law firm looking for work. And the fellow said, all right, I'll meet you out at Roxbury Park at 8:30 Tuesday night. And I thought, well, that's a strange place to hold a business meeting. But I'd heard about Hollywood. And so I went there, and it was the Roxbury Park. It's the Beverly Hills Men's Stag. Absolutely amazing. And I got in there, and here were people, obviously people of some worth, some stature. Jack Bailey, Queen for a Day, was there. Chuck Chamberlain had a few years. He was there. And I was really impressed with these men. And at the close of the meeting, that, by the way, if you don't know about it, it's a 5-minute point-to-finger pitch meeting. And at the end of the meeting, the secretary looked around and said, well, let's see, who will get to close it? How about the young fellow down here with the shiny black hair? Your humble servant 55 years ago. And so I got up and closed it. And I'd been in AA now for, better part of an hour and a quarter. I'm a very fast study. Chameleon-like, I take on the hue of whatever environment you put me in. Put me in jail, and I become a regular. Get butt off screw. Terrified somebody's going to put the arm on me, but I'd been in AA now, as I say, for more than an hour, and I could see here humility was the gig. And I can out-humble anybody, any clown in a house when I put my mind to it. So I got it up, and I gave them a minute or two of pathos, a minute or two of humor, ended on a rising note of hope, and they swarmed around me. One fellow said, would you mind, you haven't spoken out the Arroyo Seco recently, have you? Why? I just drunk my way down from San Francisco with a brief stop for some undergraduate work at Camarillo. So I had no idea what the Arroyo Seco was, so I was reasonably certain I hadn't spoken there. And I wasn't in all that bad shape, because this was Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever it was. It was Wednesday night meeting, actually, because I'd been drunk naturally all weekend, but I'd tapered off on Monday. In fact, I think I had some chili on Tuesday. So I wasn't in bad shape. It was very quick, but I wasn't in bad shape. And so he said, I'm leading the meeting out at the Arroyo Seco. next week or something like that, would you come to be my main speaker? And I said, certainly, always glad to help the poor devil crushed by the juggernaut demon rum. Yeah. So it's obvious, you see, that, and I got there, I stayed sober for 2 years, just on the novelty of applause and a solid bowel movement. And why do people giggle at that? Those of you who are made of sterner stuff, I mean, he jests at scars who never felt a wound. But if you had had the fever that I did during the war years, you wouldn't do that. You would realize the sense of worth, the rise in self-esteem, yeah, even the conviction of manly virility, the first time you're able to break wind without fear of following through. That should get you one birthday cake at least. But the thing was, I was still unemployed, and I had learned after a brief sojourn in AA that our stories could be the source of innocent merriment. The only thing was, no one had warned me that the non-alcoholic would fail to see the humor in them. And so I remember interviewing went in to talk to a large law firm. I thought I'd tell them a few light stories. I didn't want them to love me for myself. I'd outgrown the need for human approval. No, I wanted them to love me to the glory of your name, and so that I'd get a job. And I told, maybe a little icebreaker, like the time I threw my mother-in-law down the steps. And then fell after her being drunk and got a hernia, or something like that. This guy didn't giggle a gig, tit or tit. He just kind of stared at me. And I thought, I guess I'm being too subtle for him. So I told him about the time I was in 4-point restraint and vomited straight up. And that got a reaction. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to recommend me. He said, recommend you? Recommend you? I wouldn't offer your name for consideration. No attorney in the history of this nation has ever done the things that you've done or had happen to him, the things that have happened to you. I suggest you forget the law. Go into the countryside, try to regain your health and simple labor. When we send members of this law firm into a courtroom, they represent strength in the face of adversity, determination, grit. Send you? Never. I was crushed. I had not expected that. I was just totally crushed. If I could have slithered like a serpent across the floor under the door and drowned the shame of that in that bottomless bottle like I always had, I'd have done it. But I thought, if I do, that fellow will be right. And I'm not going to give him the satisfaction. Went out and drank coffee at him. 10 years later, this guy flipped out, took the check protector, the secretaries, ran to Paris, disgraced the law firm, disgraced the legal profession, disgraced his family, disgraced the city of Pasadena. One of the most beautiful pyrotechnic displays of misconduct I ever saw, and he did it cold sober. 30 years later, the governor of our state called me and told me he was appointing me to the appellate bench. As far as I know, the highest judicial office ever held by a sober alcoholic, at least in the state of California. If I entered a courtroom and members of that firm were there, they stood up and they remained standing until I told them they could be seated. All power to the powerless. And yet, as I say, I haven't changed all that much. I learned to laugh at myself, which, should you fail to do it, will cause you to miss the greatest joke in your generation, in all probability. I don't drink, which is the greatest change that can come into the life of an alcoholic, but basically I'm the same as I always was. Ideas are important to me. I don't get emotionally involved. I'm glib. And I did a good job. I took myself lightly and my job seriously, which is kind of unique in the judiciary. Strike that on the tape. But the thing is that, well, you know, when I wrote a decision, it would be published, if I ordered it published, it was published in every law library in the United States, every English-speaking country. And AA comes into our life and changes the way we talk and the way we think. We have our own litany. We're not always aware of it, but we do. You know, you're in a store and you bump into somebody in the checkout line. No, go ahead. Easy does it. No, first thing for, oh, you remember Bill? Bill. We have things that we say and do. And I found they were creeping in, they would come into my own writing things, you see. For example, a case came up on a demur and so on. And in law, when a person's complaint is challenged, we talk about what his cause of action is. We'll say he's trying to state a cause of action in tort or in contract or whatever. I don't know why we phrase it that way. We'll say it sounds in tort or it sounds in contract. I don't know. I guess Blackstone said that 300 years ago, and somebody said, hey, that's a grabber. But I had a case come up, and I wrote a decision that said no point would be served in analyzing appellate's complaint in detail. Suffice it to say, it sounds in self-pity and resentment, but states no cause of action known to the law. You know. I wrote another one that said, in law as in life, half measures avail us nothing. My colleagues say, where do you get those expressions? I don't know, they just come to me. You know. But as I say, I have not really changed all that much. I sat on the California Supreme Court, pro temping, and 7 of us in our black robes, all deadly serious on the outside, 6 apparently serious on the inside. One of us saying, if they could see me at the Al-Anon Club tonight. And that terrible imp of the perverse, the tongue that I have never been able to control, will cut in, you know. And we say things that, I remember one guy, his client had murdered several people and hadn't been entirely honest when he had first been apprehended. And the attorney was trying to get us not to be too harsh on him for that mendacity. And I heard myself, or at least someone where I was seated, lean forward and say, do not worry, Counselor. We all understand that murder often leads to lying. Fortunately, I didn't follow it up by saying if he doesn't stop it, he'll be drinking and get into real trouble. But these things have all been good, and my character traits were used, I hope, for some good for this state and this judicial system. But we've done all kinds of things, my wife and I. 25 years ago, a union that I had been in for a long time ended, and I thought no good can come of this but break my heart in two. But after a few years of batching it with my youngest son, I'd like to tell you that we were able to communicate, my son and I, together, one-to-one. But people who say they communicate with their pubescent children will lie about other things, too. Obviously, you don't communicate with an adolescent. They have no command of the English language. They can't speak. They have primordial grunts that they put to music and turn it up real loud, you see. I didn't communicate with him. He lived in the front of the house. I lived in the rear. The only time I used to see him, I'd throw money in the hall and wait. But after a year or two of that, along came a beautiful young woman who ventured in where angels would have feared to tread and brought us both through our adolescence, as it were. And she's young and she's beautiful, and yet she seems to like me. Doesn't even object to old age creeping on her at night, which is... And I don't mean to indicate why I say childlike. She got 36 years sobriety. And she went back to law school after we were married and finished it up and passed the bar just so she could criticize my decisions. And we've done wonderful things together. Some of you probably have heard me describe the stuff that I've done while I was sober. And I thought of them as things that were ebullient living, getting out and doing things. You know, I used to describe how some guy said, why are your program, why is it more enthusiastic than mine? I said, well, I don't know what my program is. Maybe I do different things. Have you learned to fly since you've been sober? No. I did. I went out and took 3 hours of training out at the old Whiteman Airport, rented a plane that weekend as soon as I soloed and flew to San Francisco. You know, I didn't know anything about navigation. They didn't have any instruments. I just flew over Highway 101. Ha ha, down there. Work the steps down there. Work the steps. Took my first free fall parachute jump just before I became a grandfather about 20-some years ago. 30, good Lord, 30 years ago. Ooh, quite a while ago. I took up scuba diving. I know you're supposed to study. You know, they teach you how to put on snorkels and masks and swim in a pool and stuff like that. And I don't have time for that. I mean, hum a couple of bars, I'll pick it up, is the way I am with things. I put on all of the gear, jumped in out Catalina Island, stayed down so long in the beautiful seaweed city, I ran out of air. You know, I give my higher power a real test. This is the nice thing about our program. I haven't made a mistake, a single error, a faux pas in decades. On the other hand, God has seen fit to do through me some of the dumbest, most petty, egomaniacal, lewd and lurid things. But I've taken the third step. Take it up with Him, for God's sakes. If He wants to make me look like a horse's ass, who are you to criticize? See, we've hiked in the Alps. We've gone down the whole length of the Grand Canyon on a raft. We decided we'd try rafting. And we thought we'd maybe sign up for something for a day or two. But for me, moderation is a rumor. We found you could go down the whole length of the Grand Canyon if you'd sign up for 10 days. And so we signed up and got together at Flagstaff or wherever it is, and they went down to put us on a raft. And in the orientation thing, before we got in there, a bunch of people were going to take different rafts, and people were smoking. Well, we'd had to quit smoking, and so we thought, we're going to be down in the bottom of this hole with a bunch of people who are smoking, and then one guy said, he's not taking any beer. Can I take 2 cases? We thought, oh, God, what have we done? Let's cut our losses and get out of here. But we decided, what the heck, we'd come this far, we'd do it. We got down there. On the raft we got assigned to, there were 9 Jehovah's Witnesses from Texas and 2 Mormons. Nobody smoked, nobody drank. We had a hell of a good time. Speaking of quitting smoking, it's odd. I was born in the backwoods of Oregon, where we used to raise our own food and shoot deer all year long, hang the venison in the smoke shed behind the house. I know what smoke does to raw meat, but for 35 years I made lung jerky. Yeah. And when I quit smoking, they told me I had to get into something that would help salvage what was left of my lungs. I used to think I was in great shape because I raced motorcycles out in the desert with Steve McQueen and so on, and I could blow the young kids off on the weekends. It didn't occur to me it's because I could afford a better machine. But then I stalled at one time on the side of a hill and tried to push, and I thought I was going to die. An airplane flew over, and I thought, a better man than you know is dying, and you don't care. I thought it must be the altitude. I'm up here at 200 or 300 feet. And then I heard my secretary say, "Oh, yes, he's in. I can hear him breathing." So I quit the smoking. And smoking is the very easiest thing in the world to quit when you're ready. Until then, it's impossible. Get on your knees, bark like a dog for a week, and, that's it. But to salvage it, they said you had to get into running. Try running. Of all of the forms of locomotion known to man, that has to be the most despicable. I've always seen runners, usually old men with gnarled, knobby knees, grunting and panting along the sides of highways with sweatbands on them. And I would think, poor devils, that should come to that. And then 30 years ago, they began running like crazy hit. They were running right in my neighborhood. I live in a decent neighborhood, and I thought, God, I hope they don't steal anything, those hairy people out there. And then I got into it. Now, a fanatic is anybody who's doing something a week before I start. Now I was just astonished at how many distinguished ladies and gentlemen one could see in the morning in their underwear out on the street. And I couldn't go half a block to start off with. Gasp and pant. But I kept it up. I have a thing for pain. And I caught myself leaving my house one night to go to a meeting, and I was skipping. Hip-dee-dip-dee-dip. And I instantly stopped. Jesus, God, I hope the neighbors didn't see that. I didn't skip as a boy. I've been called Mr. Gates since I was 13. I allow my intimates to call me sir. And I'm skipping. And I thought, what is wrong with you? And then I realized nothing was wrong with me. On the contrary, I'd done something which was good for my body, and it was rewarding me. It was giving me a shot of endorphins, that endogenous morphine that the body produces when you subject it to any kind of a strain or stress. Now, no one had ever told me that that was going to happen. They had told me running was good for me, which I construed as a threat. They didn't tell me it'll make you feel good. They didn't know how to communicate. You can imagine what happened when I found that was what, if 2 miles will get you high, how about 4, 8, 16? I mean, before the summer was out, I was running half marathons. Had stress fractures in both feet, bursitis, the hip, my back gave out. I didn't have a moment free from pain after I got healthy. But I ended up running 5 marathons, 26 milers. I don't recommend that sort of thing, but it is astonishing what you can do in this program. And I look back on all of these things that we have done. And I was watching a PBS show one night, and they were talking about the brain. Not alcoholic brain, just the brain, how you can touch various portions of it and produce every sensation known to man by just the electronic touches. And they showed a picture of a guy driving fast. And they said, he drives this way because he's an alcoholic. Alcoholics do not produce endorphins like other people. And that's why, for them, life is kind of a grinding thing. It's like a non-lubricated engine. And I realized then that everything I was doing was what he was describing as a risk sport. Risks will produce endorphins. Why do people ride on roller coasters? It scares them. When they get off, want to go again, Myrtle? Clancy in his talk stresses how between drunks we are nervous, restless, irritable, discontented, our book tells us. I agree with that. But it doesn't help me. I want to know, why are we like that? We're not doing it on purpose, are we? And the idea, I don't know whether it's true or not, but the idea that we do not produce that lubricating substance known as endorphins, but when we take a shot of whiskey, then they are produced in a rush that the non-alcoholic never gets. And All of these things I have learned in AA. AA, for me, has not been a process of elimination. It's been a process of substitution. It's been a process of living. When I was drinking, I didn't do anything. Sat and looked at that mirror image and did nothing, thought and did nothing. And now I think I have done everything that I ever fantasized about doing and never did when I was drinking. Most of it I wouldn't repeat, by the way. You can do it in that position, but it'll throw your back out. Now, if I could communicate anything to people, and I know at my age I probably can't, but I just buried the last member of my generation ahead of me, 98-year-old lady. And when I was driving taxi cab in college, they used to say the fares would move the cabs out, and pretty soon you'd be first up. You're next out. When all of the generation ahead of you is gone, you suddenly realize you're first up. You're next out. And I regret the things that I did in life that hurt other people, but not nearly as much as the things that I didn't do when I had a chance to do them. Somebody once said, the unexamined life isn't worth living, to which the reply came, and the unlived life isn't worth examining. We have to get out and do it right now. Now is the only time we have. If you want to do something to improve society, strike a blow for justice, you have to do it right now. Nobody raises their hands in the tomb for righteousness' sake. If you want to do something loving, tender, gentle, Lord, you've got to do that now too. A poet said, "The grave, it is a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace." Another poet said, "Into the fires of spring your winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to flutter, and the bird is on the wing. My bird hasn't much longer to fly. I don't want to miss a single beat of those wings. I hope all you people, particularly the young ones, will stick around and we'll fly together." Thank you.